The section we're dealing with broadly deals with consumption, and specifically, we're going to elaborate points about the arts today, but I'll mention briefly the paper by Glazer et al. On Consumer City. It's in this book, and then it's a little longer version in the version that's on Canvas. They have a couple of basic points that are useful generally here for consumption. We're starting. We have started. They have 4 points about amenities, and amenities is the big concept from economics, which are basically what's an amenity? Anybody? Yes.
An amenity.
Sorry.
An amenity.
Yes. What's an amenity?
Amenity is a good service that is provided to city residents.
Such as Starbucks.
It could be private, like Starbucks. It could be little like a park, whatever it is. Really, any kind of natural stuff.
And if you pay for it like a freeway toll, is that an amenity?
No.
The key definition is it is a non-market good. You don't pay. And it can be generated both by the government or by the private sector. So it's not the same as public-private. It's not what citizens use. It is, but yes, I mean, it is what citizens use, but the key point is citizens use without paying for them. And the critical point there is that if you pay, then you have at least a rough indication of the level and intensity of preference that citizens have. And what's the big theoretical point is that Chicago economists recognized this 30 years ago, that amenities are not only important, they're increasingly important. So they tried to measure them, and then most important, they theorized about them for a couple of decades. And Glazer is trying to synthesize some of this Chicago amenities tradition.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, the most dramatic single result is one which I illustrated when I asked how many of you would take a job in a small town in North Dakota for $100,000, or the same job in Chicago or New York or LA for $50,000. And almost all of you said, well, I'm willing to be paid half as much to live in. Okay, why is that so critical? It says wages may go down, but amenities may go up, and more people may keep coming to Chicago, New York, San Francisco. And that's what's been happening visibly and dramatically in the last, especially the last decade, last 2 decades. And so people talk about these as elite cities or exploitative cities or whatever, but they are still going up more. And so the question is why? And Glazer's quick answer is the density. So this is where I would say, I mean, his smart big idea is really not his. What he's stressing here, I would say too much, is the idea of density as a driver. Certainly density counts, but he's using it sort of as a rough idea, a little more sophisticated than city size. And it fits with at least with the idea that if you have more density, and he's got some powerful points, but he's got some weak points too. So my simple comment is simply don't overstress density if there are many better measures of what's associated with density, like education of the citizens and the types of occupations, the diversity of taste. So he doesn't really talk about specific types of taste. And that's a weakness of this is the classic neoclassical economic approaches to say taste, preferences, that belongs to sociology or somebody else. But some of the newest economists are now, in the last decade or so, they're changing even that, and they're beginning to look at subgroups, subcategories, because some different groups have different tastes. So this is featured sometimes with the arguments associated with diversity, race, class, gender, and national origin, reflect tastes. And so I would say, don't assume it, because that's what Florida basically did. Florida created in his book that made a huge splash, the rise of creative class. He included what he called an index of bohemianism. But what was in his index? Anybody look at that and remember? Simple census measures. The numbers of people working in occupations sort of artistic, people who have, or then, that sometimes he uses that. Sometimes he has about 4 different measures in the book and for different purposes, because different data are only sometimes available. But second, he sometimes just talks about non-manual laborers. Anybody who doesn't work with their hands is creative. And clearly that, and so he then refutes that by saying, my father worked as a manual laborer. People doing manual labor in a factory can be very creative. You can work on a production line and make suggestions and find ways to make the production line work more efficiently with your hands. So there can be and is, so then he talks about, say, intermediary people, haircutters, barbers, salon people. They use their hands, but they're aesthetically driven in making a beautiful, glamorous person or a more glamorous haircut. Then other people have gone a little further and taken this and said, how much does a haircut cost if you're in Hollywood or if you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma? And it costs a lot more to get an average haircut in Hollywood than it does in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Because more people, okay, I won't say why, but I'll simply report that as an example of how tastes interact with and are not reducible just to income or education or occupation. Okay. Another weakness of Glaser, but which is leading into this section, is it doesn't talk about the arts per se. And what I'm getting at it, the arts are not important as an occupational category. The arts are important because they refine more about how people react to amenities. And the point is there's a more aesthetic reaction, not just an efficiency. The classic economic term of efficiency means supply and demand intersect in ways that you get the best deal, the most for your money through a market, through competition, freedom of entry, etc. And with commodified so-called products, that works fine, like shoes that are red. But if you don't just say they're red shoes, you have to say they're beautiful shoes. Then it gets more complicated. How do you define beauty? Because it may be that different people or with more subtlety that comes in. And I'll just add quickly that Glaser's reacting against his father, his own father, who was an expert on historic preservation and arts stuff. And so he's brought up surrounded by the arts and this kind of thing, which is unusual, but he went a little too far in saying, yes, I'll take some of it, but no, okay. This is basically what he calls the second point. The second amenity is aesthetics and physical setting. But when he comes to talking about it, he says, well, January temperature. That's because that's what economists have used. It's clear, simple, objective. It's standardly available from the census data, and you can analyze it statistically with other things. So that's fine as far as it goes, but conceptually, he leaves out some of the additional critical parts of the arts. Okay. He then talks about public services as amenities, good schools, less crime, are linked with urban growth. That crime decreases growth. Okay, that's fine. I won't disagree with that, except to say, well, now let me quickly. What's wrong with this sentence, which says, crime is associated with lower population growth. Then he says, dropout rates among three authors, among teenagers, controlling for the educational level of adults and the poverty rate are strongly associated negatively with growth from 1970 to 1990. Schools and low crime also appear to be important in attracting a highly educated workforce. Okay, what's the problem with what he said in the case of crime and schools? Yeah.
It seems like he's attributing an effect of like economic mosaics be the cause. Like it seems like lower growth would be the effect of like a declining economy and so be apparent in lower in school dropout rates and like increased crime rather than just the lack of growth being the cause of people having lower crime rates and higher crime.
Yes, and you're making the main point, which I want to make, and I'll just elaborate briefly. So yes. But put differently, he doesn't talk about taste or lifestyle or anger or disrespect or resentment, which I'm very conscious of living in Bronxville. People are angry. I just driving down, I heard an African-American mayor of a small town in Michigan articulating, he used the word politricks. Okay, politricks captures that in a word. There's anger, there's resentment, and that's behind the looting in Chicago and 50 largest cities. And it's linked with race, but are all Black people resentful? No, it's not just race. It is anger, which is separate, which can be analyzed as a cultural and sometimes arts related kind of thing, because artists, I'm starting with artist stuff here is what do the arts add? And for that, I want to go back and forth between some of my comments and then some of the readings on the list. So let's now shift more to the arts, having gone over a bit of Glazer. So let me make one more point to say. Glazer is brilliant. He's very innovative in going beyond the traditional economic supply and demand kinds of analysis. And so I pointed out how he hasn't gone far enough, but he still has gone a lot further than okay, let me tell one more story with Glazer. I went to a session of the Chicago Federal Reserve, and the director of research, director of research presented what's the forecast, what's the economic situation of the Midwest, and what do we forecast for the next year or so. He talked about production, jobs, output measured in a couple of different ways. He talked about nothing but production. So I went up to him afterward and I said, you're leaving out what they say in City Hall is the major driver of the city: entertainment, restaurants, lifestyle, the theater. lakefront activities. And these are bringing people to conventions and they're staying on after these. So he said, you know, that's a good point. So he then came to some of the meetings which we had. He heard some of our meetings, discussions. He looked at some of our publications, and then he said, "Would you like to set up a session with the Chicago Federal Reserve people, and we'll hold a conference on the importance of amenities?" And I said, "Okay, but what if we do it together with Ed Glazer? Because the economists, because it would be all there were about 70 economists who came. And they respected Ed Glazer more than me, you know, I'm not an economist. So together, we went over these kinds of points. And at the end of the day, of the 70, I would say at the beginning of the day, nobody said anything, I agree, or this is a good point. At the end of the day, 1/3 of the people said, I've changed my mind. 1/3, I would say, hadn't, based on the discussion, probably had not changed their minds, and 1/3 just it said nothing. But my point is, with one day's discussion of this stuff, smart economists say, hey, this is true. And the economics department here, the faculty, this was 20 years ago, we had that meeting. The faculty here have changed substantially. The young new faculty are doing all kinds of stuff. And Glazer was a leader in doing that. And Glazer himself, in his first 10 years, got tenure at Harvard. After he got tenure, he did more traditional production, economic kinds of papers. He writes about religion, he goes to church, trust, and then one is happiness. Big economic, lots of smart economists are studying happiness and going well beyond what we did before. He has a paper, Glazer has a paper on happiness, and this relates to these issues. What makes people happy? And his main dramatic finding, income has almost no effect. Occupation has a minimal effect. And what matters more he didn't have 2 or 3 or 4 variables. He had, in this paper, he has about 90 variables, all different kinds of things. What came out is particularly, that is, he was testing implicitly all kinds of possible reasons that people might be happy. What were his main findings? Family, friends, friendship, feeling close to other people. Do you get along with people in general? Do they help you when you're in trouble and so forth? Personal relationships were far more important than what job you had, how much income you had, and the classic economic variables. Okay, so when he published that, he uses that, he knows that, so he can and has explicitly broken, but he also changes depending on the audience and so forth. Okay, so let's push on, focusing on the beginnings that we have in theorizing about economics, and that is theorizing about the arts and amenities and consumption, where the economists made a first important step. And I would say that, and I'll summarize it in a different way. I said it was the example of you choosing Chicago. What they have found more generally is that cities where you have cities and counties, where you have higher incomes, let me be careful, not incomes too general. Where you have higher wages paid for a particular occupation, where wages are high or going up, you tend to have fewer amenities. So people, that put differently, if you don't have those things that is keeping you people in Chicago, if you don't have these amenities, you've got to pay more and increase what you pay people, or they'll leave and go to Chicago or New York or LA. Okay. So in that sense, that's a major counterintuitive finding. And I've had many economists, PhD candidates from China who come here and say, Oh, people leave the rural area and they go to the urban areas because they get paid more. It's false, or at least the main finding, counterintuitive with the Chicago research is the opposite of that. People don't go to the biggest cities for paying more. They go there because it's exciting. They can find more things to do, and they can tell their friends and relatives back in the small rural area, my son is now in Beijing. Okay, I want to elaborate because our whole SEAMS analysis in China has done this, but a lot of those people are really underpaid or unemployed. They're living in big dormitories, dormitory-like private housing. You know, there may be four beds on top of each other, and they travel 2 hours one way by subway to get to downtown Beijing. Okay, so there's a book which documents this, which has been a bestseller in China and which has led to a concern with changing the domestic lifestyle of people who especially are lower income, and how in bigger cities like Beijing, in part because they don't have the rights to be in Beijing, so they have to live further out, and it costs more, etc. That is, they have rights to government services, healthcare, and so forth in their rural area, but the downtown, okay. And so that is, the Chinese have tried to prevent lots of rural people coming to cities, so they don't give them these rights, and so they say stay in your rural area, because they don't want to have what you have in most of Africa and Latin America, all these surrounding areas surrounding the big cities of very poor, angry, dense, dangerous kinds of people. Okay, so the interpenetration of these is what we can begin to see if we look more closely at the arts. Okay, let's look at a few of these and then come back and generalize more broadly. One of the best studies on our list is an ethnography called by Richard Lloyd called Neo-Bohemia. He grew up in Oakland, California, went to Berkeley College. He came here with a BA, and he worked as a trader in the options market in Chicago for about 10 years, eight or 10 years. He lived in Wicker Park, surrounded by artists, and some were artists. They increased in number, but Wicker Park was the most artistic neighborhood of Chicago, and it generally had a bohemian lifestyle, as defined by Balzac and Baudelaire. And we talked about it last section. He has almost no numbers, and he has the weaknesses: no numbers, no government. He doesn't talk about government doing anything. He writes as if all this is being done by individuals and by local shops or whatever. A follow-up, just to frame Lloyd, it's a follow-up 10, 15 years later, 2005. Roughly 10 to 15 years later, finds that the artists have moved out because it's gotten too expensive, but they preserve the bohemian lifestyle. What keeps it there? It's not occupation. It's not the job. It was the specific conscious discussions. This is what's fascinating in this follow-up of the merchants who said, we brought stockbrokers, lawyers, Google employees to live in Wicker Park, and they come here because they like the lifestyle. How can we preserve that if we don't have the artists and so on? So that they have a little bit, that is, they have once a month, I think it is twice a month, they'll have artists who come back, and many artists will have galleries, or they'll have galleries featuring the artists, and they'll have an arts night. But day and nights, 24/7, the shops look bohemian. You go into the clothing stores, what do they have featured? Bohemian kinds of stuff. They're more gays and lesbians visibly featured. You have themes like that in discussions in cafes and bookstores. In another PhD by Yi-Sung Jong, she has a detailed study of one of the bookstore cafes and gone through the kinds of presentations they have. So they have talks, they have people who come and talk, and they're on all sorts of lifestyle kinds of issues, classically bohemian. Okay, so I'm pointing to, or what he points to, is the lack of simple association between income, occupation, even education, and bohemianism. So he calls it neo-bohemianism because it's not as if this is just the 19th century version. You can be a bohemian and be a web designer and live, and there are many web designer shops in Wicker Park today. So the broader concept of which is bobo, bohemian combined with bourgeois, bobo, and the French use that as if it's a French term and concept because the two original terms are, but the combination with putting bo with both bo is David Brooks, New York Times editorial writer, in his book on the two books really on the bobos. Basically, bobos are people who are bohemian, but they make a little more money. And they can become not just starving artists, they may become web designers. Or then they look for occupations where you can use some of your bohemian style. And one which he features is bartenders and servers in restaurants and bars. He has a long section on that. Let me just briefly give you a powerful illustration about how this can transform stuff. These are usually people who are would-be artists. They want to do painting or they want to do poetry or whatever. But he points out, and at least in the ones which he talked to, most of them are doing almost no art. Why not? They work as bartenders and servers, both men and women. Fair number of women, but both genders. They work hard and they get more, well, they dress in bohemian style. They act, they look, their hairstyles, their actions, their language, and also especially appearance, and they're in bohemian style restaurants and bars and so forth. Second, they work very hard to get paid well through the tips. They get paid quite well, but they work maybe four or 5 days a week. And they then, what do they do on their days off? Do they go out and paint paintings? No. They've become friends with other waiters, servers, bartenders who come from other bars and restaurants in Wicker Park. And they get bigger tips from, and they feel closer to, they talk with when there are not many customers around, these other bartenders and servers. And they feel so close to them, they feel they have to give them their tips. So they give their money away to each other, which is not what you normally attribute to economics. But it's not economics, you could call it selfishness or charity, but they're articulating their shared values by giving their money away to, and so Florida reports this. I mean, he was a traitor, he was a tough traitor, he thought. But he reports this and says, you know what they're doing art at all. They're giving their money away. And then they're drinking more together. They all get drunk together. They have more fun, more social contact together. And they're not writing any poetry or doing, that is very little. Okay, so that chapter is a sort of dramatic illustration of this distinctiveness between artistic activity, which does include some hard work and creativity, along with bohemianism, which is not the same as doing art. That is, you can be a bohemian in your hair, and your clothes, and what you say, and in drinking and shouting, or being whatever. But it's not reducible to race, class, gender, or national origin in ways that this example points out. Okay, so he's got many other things like that, but he shows in ethnography where and how you can have the arts linked with, but not causing bohemia in ways that I've elaborated more conceptually, more abstractly. Let me mention then another fine ethnography. Elizabeth Kerr, she was a student. I was on her Florida, and I were on a PhD committee. She was at Columbia when we were not. For her PhD, she was fascinated by. She was trying to understand how some of these things work. She read Florida's work, and she read some of my stuff on things that led to things like this. She wanted to see, how does this work? So she listened, she talked to people in New York who were involved in design, new clothing design, artists, painters, but also popular artists, popular cultures, that's music, and then third, music. And she then, she talked with these kinds of people. What do you do? How do you spend your time? And a key thing that they talked about was, would you come with me to our club? Okay, there were some very high-end private clubs. I wouldn't say private, and they weren't really totally private clubs that you had to be a member, but they were very high priced and very exclusive. I think maybe you did have to be invited by someone else. So there are a handful of these in mostly lower Manhattan. And she went to these repeatedly. And she said, what's going on in these clubs? What are they doing? And what she documents is the interpenetration of aesthetic new ideas that go across and include clothes on the dance floor, music of various sorts, and painting and the arts in various ways. These could in turn, that is, there's an interpenetration among these occupationally separate groups, which you miss if you say, I want to look at occupations. Are these artists? That is, if you're a clothing designer, if you're a musician, okay, musician and artist, yes, but clothes designer, or let's say clothes, if you're in the clothing industry, use a bigger category, an economic category of clothing, that doesn't necessarily say that you are bohemian, whatever. But what she did, which Florida did, Florida did not do, I would say, very much. He has examples, but he doesn't articulate this. And in his Bohemian Index, he only uses census data. He doesn't articulate as much as he should, I would say, as much as they do, the aesthetics of how it works. And similarly, Blazer, and I'm faulting for not doing this, and I'm showing how the students of these very people have gone beyond their faculty. They've done new things, and they've made innovations in ways that include, or say, courage. She does it. We give her some of the data we used here. She used it for different New York and then LA neighborhoods. She's done later books on LA and sort of stars, what makes a star, and so forth. But the point is, the dynamics of innovation and ideas and color, in shock value, or using green and combining green with other things, or different types of green, etc.
are important. Can they be studied using the classic tools of economics? Yes. You just pay attention. They're bring in, so they're papers by Gary Becker Stigler, bringing in all kinds of other variables, which Becker did in his own examples in his career, such as joining a union and you're taking a position on an issue, not because you're maximizing your preferences and you have fixed preferences, but you are influenced by the union. The union says follow, vote this way, and it's good for the union. And union members do that, so the driver is not even consumer sovereignty, which is considered a classic foundation of neoclassical economics. Becker broke that rule consciously and explicitly in that paper. Okay. Let me add just one, let me stop there for any comments, questions, as you may have looked at some of these readings. I've made a couple of points, but any reactions to or questions that you want to raise about these? Let's begin to bring in some more international and qualitative. You're raising your hand? No, okay. Other kinds of examples. That is first general point. I never worked on the arts until about 20 years ago. All my books, papers, and so forth never said anything about arts as specific or different. That is, I'm not an art historian. So I did it in my own life. I was an art student in Paris and New York for a while, and I didn't have the talent to be Renoir, so I said, well, I better do something else. So I became a social scientist, not an artist. So I was sensitive. I would say I was more sensitive to things like looking at color and how things combine than I was before I did that kind of painting and got this articulated in art school. But I never wrote about it. I would say, Chicago's an ugly city, and it was 34 years ago. Chicago has transformed itself neighborhood by neighborhood in powerful ways. So seeing this happen in ways that you could talk about, well, okay, that's our scenescapes dimension and glamour, or it's transgression, or it's these other things. You can see these things happening aesthetically, perhaps before you might see them with some of the normal kinds of data and numbers. Point one, I had no bias toward the arts. That's something we should pay attention to. What convinced me was a finding, which I mentioned already briefly. If we look at when we got new data, and this happened to me, this had the same thing with the Irish that I talked about briefly. I had no hypotheses about the Irish. I didn't, I was amazed when we had that finding. It's that these were, in this sense, empirical findings that really changed the theorizing. When we got this new data for zip codes 15 years ago, I said, we pulled up the census. Do you have any data below cities? Cities are too big. We want neighborhood data. Do you have any? Oh yeah, pay us $50 and 3 months later we'll send you a CD. Okay, so we got this. Then we spent 6 months or more figuring out how to get the damn data off the CD in which you could analyze. So it's complicated. So that's why almost nobody, including urban economists, urban geographers, urban sociologists, don't use these data. They're called BizZip. They're zip code data for businesses. And they have far more categories of businesses than most people use. So people talk about service, agriculture, manufacturing. Those are ridiculously crude. You go to the BizZip stuff, and you can get down to religious organizations. You can get to web designers, specific occupations that not as close as as we can get rid of the yellow pages. So we used both in the Scenescapes book. But if you get down to these more refined data and then analyze all the zip codes, roughly 45,000 across the US, and say which grew more jobs and more income in the last X years, and then put in the normal variables used by urban geographers, economists, sociologists: income, race, any poverty, education. Put in those normal variables and density, population size, density. Then add the arts. The arts was more important than anything else, controlling all those standard variables. Okay. Nobody's ever written about this. Can this be true? And is it? And so we started to study this, and that's why this section is now new. It's not even a section of this course. I still have the old sections to go further back. But the readings are here, the ideas are here, and you're hearing them. You've heard them. That is, you've heard me talk about the arts in different ways since the very first class. I showed you Lollapalooza, the video in the first session, and said, could this be driving Chicago's economic growth? And most of you didn't say anything, but most students, when we discussed this in the past, but when one guy raised his hand, are you trying to say that Lollapalooza drives Chicago economic growth? I said, well, we're going to talk about that. Okay. Today we're talking about that, and you've seen more evidence along with. So, put differently, I didn't believe. I mean, I knew that Lollapalooza and this stuff was important, but I had no idea that this was potentially driving. And now you knock on City Hall and say, what drives the Chicago? What's the main industry in Chicago? And the answer is entertainment and tourism. And they include especially things like Lollapalooza, and they're funding them heavily. And Chicago has been a national leader in recognizing the arts, in doing this, in part because it was an ugly city, industrial, city of big shoulders. And then there were some new people coming in, which were called by the Chicago Tribune writer, popularized. He didn't invent the term, but he popularized it and took off. Yuppies. And in Chicago, the conflict with these new people, artists and yuppies and so forth, was so visible that we looked at this. We did a paper called, okay. We looked at data for New York, Chicago, and LA. We looked at people who were college graduates who moved into and who increased in numbers and who moved into Chicago, New York, and LA, and found that in Chicago, let me back up. In New York and LA, they lived in neighborhoods all over New York and LA. College graduates in Chicago lived highly disproportionately in Wicker Park and arts-related neighborhoods. Why? Because some of those bartenders were saying in Wicker Park, they're saying, you know, you're welcome here. Whereas in many other Chicago neighborhoods, like Bridgeport, they'll say, no yuppies in this bar. Okay. In the 19th century, no Irish need apply. Okay. Okay. So there was a big literature, people attacking. I mean, any person who carries a newspaper, or, you know, a New York Times, a Wall Street Journal, has a Starbucks and is walking a dog, they're a yuppie. You don't want them in your neighborhood. Okay, that kind of visible, explicit labeling of lifestyle defined by walking a dog and Starbucks was very striking in Chicago. Now it's gone away. Lori Lightfoot was elected by many of these folks. Okay. Okay, so quick point I'm making was, I didn't start with this. It hit me in the face, and then what I've been doing ever since is trying to say, how does it work? And how much, and what does arts mean? Because, in part, not all artists are bohemian. So that was the paper with Florida. So Florida made the point, gays, I mean, I would say in similar manner, not all gays are bohemian. And not all of gays, and there's a good, excellent book on this. Not all lesbians have a quote lesbian lifestyle. Says that she did, woman who did a Brown, the last name is Brown Saraceno, hyphenated. She studied four towns across the U.S. from Maine to Ithaca, small town in Maine, Ithaca, New York, another place I forget, and then a beach town in California. Then she studied the lesbian, what the lesbians do that are distinctive and visible. Okay, in Cornell, in the Cornell town of Ithaca, they wear business suits. There is no, that is, lesbians were not visibly distinctive at all. They had not, quote, come out in that sense. And the beach in California, they wore bikinis and they were touching each other on the beach, playfully, visibly defining themselves as women enjoying other women's sensual activities. Okay. Being a lesbian does not define how you live. It does not define your lifestyle. It doesn't say how you dress. Same thing for gays, same thing for blacks, etc. Okay, so the point is, if you begin to pay attention to that, you then look more closely at where and how these things change. Example, there's a book came out just a year or two ago called something like the End of the Gayborhood. That is in the U.S., in many places in the U.S., but most visibly in what was called Boys Town on the north side, near the Cubs, just closer to the lake than the Cubs Stadium. Boys Town was known for boys meeting boys. It increased in popularity, rents went up, and so forth. It has now gone down. There are not so many people there on Friday or Saturday night. And gayborhoods, the study shows, the book shows, have gone down in general in the US. Why? His quick answer is because there's more tolerance. People no longer, many gays don't act, I mean, they've come out, they don't feel they have to. That is, you've had gay parades. That is, along with Boys Town being visible, used to have a gay parade, and they still do. But 15, 20 years ago, people had no shirts on, they were in trucks, and they were sort of visibly acting openly, sexually, slightly promiscuously, let's say. Point is, today, at least the data articulated in this book, is that gays don't need to go to a gay neighborhood in order to meet. They know each other. Most people know they have friends all the way. Or they may get invited on a blind date or something like that. But the point is, the iPhone, so email and the advertising of restaurants and so forth has replaced the gayborhood so the physical proximity is no longer as important as it once was. So in that way, these two examples of lesbians and gays illustrate is, again, it's the same point as Florida for artists in Wicker Park. Lifestyle and values and how you're living and acting and feeling is not necessarily reducible to the place like Boys Town or to the occupation. Take artists again. You may have a woman who's the wife of a high-end
stockbroker who lives in a Chicago suburb, and she does a little bit of watercoloring. She may have zero ideas about bohemianism, but she does her watercoloring. Or she may become a more professional, she may sell some of them, so she may in that sense become slightly professional. Put differently, there are some, and I mean, I've talked to Art Institute students, I've gone to many meetings now since this. Who are these people? You know, how are artists, how do they think, what do they do? I've been to meetings such as the city downtown, the staff in the cultural affairs department in the old Harold Washington, the old library, which is now called the Cultural Center. It houses the leadership of the cultural affairs department, and it has museum kinds of stuff, and arts activity. They put on their meetings of about 100. They were attended by about 100 artists. And they would have maybe 3 people say, how can you sell your paintings? How can you get access to museums? How can you make some money by, or where can you get a place to work so you can paint? So they have topics like this, and they'd have 3 people saying totally different things. So for instance, one guy would say, the way you want to sell your paintings is to email everybody you possibly know, all the contacts you can get, and say, I've got a new painting, come and look, and so forth, buy it. Or buy something like it. Another guy said, I have dinners for some of my close friends, and we'll talk, and maybe in the middle of the dinner, one of them would say, you know, where do the plates come from? This is really nice, nice plates on the table. So we'll do those. Okay, so these 2 people were on the panel. And so then we had, 100 artists agree, disagree, where and why and how. Yes, but then one thing I heard that was interesting, qualitative example. People said when asked, how much of your time do you spend doing art, doing paintings and making porcelain if you're that artist? The main answer they said was about 10%. 90% of their time they're spending looking for a place to work, doing another job like being a bartender, or trying to get their work sold, or applying for a grant or whatever. But it's a tough life to be an artist. Okay. Even harder than a student at the University of Chicago. Although sometimes, so put differently, artists and students, grad students with a grad student scholarship, or probably undergraduates with a scholarship, is probably less than the poverty wage, the what's called term, I'm blocking out the term for it. The wage that you have to pay to have people go to work. That is because most of the money which you get if you're in poverty in Bronzeville, you get food stamps, you get stuff in kind, or you get the access to social services, which are only if you're below a certain level of income and so forth. In order to get people who get that these are worth about $70,000. To get people to go to work for $9 an hour at McDonald's, or let's say a plate, doesn't work. Okay, so the point is amenities, including things that you don't pay for, whether you're rich or poor, shift whether or not you work, where you work, what you do, and what you have to do if you're an artist and you're in that kind of low income category. You pay a lot of attention to things of that sort. There's a book by a French sociologist working on how do artists support themselves, and the French have had in Chicago and France have many more. I made this point before. There's a link between Paris and Chicago. And Daley went there and brought back a lot of ideas from Paris. And I told you about the bus stops
the boulevards all around Paris and all around Chicago. In that sense, Daley was trying to be a 20th century Haussmann. Haussmann really created that boulevard system after he tore down a lot of the little alleys. Okay, we'll talk about more of that as we proceed. But for now, the simple point is the occupational category artist doesn't tell you that people are bohemian, just as gay and lesbian, low income don't necessarily tell you some of the things for sure. They don't, okay. Any examples you want to bring that would potentially challenge or question or look for elaboration in some of the things that you've talked about? And okay. And I'll give a hint and say big cities and the American South are great places to look. If you have anything you want to question or examples to bring in that we could talk about, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's pretty broad. But I don't know, Nashville is obviously a city that's growing a lot currently with the arts culture. But I'm curious about the,
Rick Lloyd took a job at Vanderbilt. He's been there for 10 years and he's written lots of stuff about Nashville and the artists' activities within Nashville. So go ahead. Maybe he's written about it.
right, I mean, I guess I'm sure, maybe this isn't the type of question or comment you're looking for, but I'm curious about the way that,
Find a challenge. That's
right,
great.
like the identity of a city.
So say that again slowly.
Identity.
Identity.
So like, for example, Nashville, I think, has made a lot of its arts culture surround upon its identity of being in the South, its identity as the home of country music. And yeah, I guess the role that plays in all of this. Especially I'm thinking about the comment you made at the beginning around arts, around the way that people find happiness. I feel like there's a direct community, and I think that maybe identity, or like the idea of a city having an identity and someone being able to participate in that identity or adopt that identity. I don't know how arts can play into that as well.
Yes, for sure. I mean, identity is a more psychological label, but many of the things I've talked about have a psychological reverberation, but I'm defining it or discussing it more using terms like culture and art, which can be anthropological, sociological, but can also be, you can look at the subjective side. I mean, I have a BA in psychology, I took a lot of courses in social psychology. I did a book on Gabrielle Tart, who really did this. Parsons talked about, for instance, how culture, personality, and social structure are three big categories that interpenetrate. It's not as if one causes the other, or they're closed compartments. They have something like bohemianism can be present both in identity and in the social structure, in the sense that you may live together with people, say lesbians may live together rather than in heterogeneous lifestyle. That's a social structure measure, which you can get from classic family social structure kinds of things. And then occupation. So occupations may be linked with bohemians. And I've used the example from Lloyd of bartender and servers as doing things, but the underlying identity part is, and we could even call identity in these examples, bohemian. So in that sense, there's no conflict. I mean, identity is plays up, the ways that, say, a cultural, meaningful concept like bohemian may work in your mind, but if we listen to psychologists talking about this, or read what they say and read what economists say about it, they often say the same things. That is, and so this is why to get to the subtleties of how this worked, we'll talk about later, Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's main source of evidence about Paris, of how Paris and bohemianism worked, was, anybody know, or jumping forwards, and probably you don't. Anybody who happen to know what, okay, I showed you briefly the arcade project, and his book called The Arcade Project, and the question is, why was Paris so different? And the answer was, the amenities and the types of activities which they did were, to simplify, bohemian. But what was his source? His source, his data, his evidence was Baudelaire, and then later on the other artists. He didn't go to the census and try to measure this kind of stuff. That is, he was looking for meaning in poetry, in writings, and even essays written by Baudelaire and by my co-author of Scenescapes, Dan Silver, did a PhD on the conception of the street in Baudelaire. That was his PhD topic. Okay. He didn't know how to count. He didn't know any statistics. Right? And so after a couple of years of working together, we tried to put all this stuff together. Okay. So in that sense, let me stop there. You have maybe a different, or let me give one more example and then ask if you want to follow up. Take, for instance, people identify with cities. So sports teams, in Chicago, if you watch people leaving a Chicago big sports stadium, and you can see from their faces if they won or lost. And so people are happier in Boston when the Boston teams win, and that is the idea. So in a sense that the identity of a Chicagoan links with the sports team's success, links with your personal happiness is the hypothesis. And so the city identity in that sense is or Southern identity. Similar manner, lesbian identity. Maybe, or put differently, what I'm trying to get at is lesbian identity ain't so rigid and clear as people often impose by saying she's lesbian, therefore she thinks this way. If you have these kinds of, if you look more closely, differences in 4 different cities in the U.S. So I'm accepting the point for sure. We're talking about identity, but I or others can easily make some of the bigger points about identity. But let me hesitate for a second. You want to elaborate either anything on Nashville or the South or contract, because you're doing things. You're now here. What you said you're doing. You're working in social activities. You're conscious clearly of the big differences in this respect. Any of these you want to elaborate or ask about?
I'm not sure. I guess I'm kind of unclear on the question you're asking.
How does identity, what's an example of identity you have in the back of your mind when you ask the question?
I can see it as like a
City
counter
or South?
example to the point that you were putting forward. I guess it's just a different question that I had sort of from the beginning. But I guess on the question of how cities in the American South might be different, is that the question that you were asking? How might
If that's what you have in mind, I'm asking, yeah, we can talk about that, but my general question is there something else about identity you had in mind that I haven't spoken to?
No, I don't think so. I think I was just interested in how arts and how arts can be specific to, different cities and different areas, and how that sense of identity ties into the point that you made at the beginning about, creating, like, making people, what makes people happy. And so it's not, arts is a factor that facilitates growth, but also facilitates happiness in the sense that it can correct some sort of identity.
Okay, good, yes. Yes, tell us your name, please, and where are you from?
I'm Nate, and I'm from Austin, Texas.
Okay,
So I just have like a perspective that sort of reminds me of that. But just on the thought of identity, I think Austin is a really interesting place because in like the late 20th century, there's this whole like Keep Austin Weird tourism campaign that's all over the bumper stickers and everything. And at least in my lifetime, I've seen like Austin residents sort of be like, no, that's a tourist thing, and sort of like pushed out like city identity that was such like a important part of tourism at one point, sort of, associated with these people that don't live here, I guess. That's just something I was thinking. And Austin is just also interesting because there's a huge, I guess, art sector with the music festivals and all these different tourism things, but there's also a very large, I don't know if it's economic, but you have big like firms like Tesla moving to Austin as well. So these two sort of like competing with, arts are growing, there's also these like, high paying tech jobs for certain companies. So that's just interesting.
I know Amazon is open to headquarters in Nashville. I think Austin and Nashville are pretty similar in a lot of ways. But yeah, that's another thing that I was thinking about is how a lot of people who have, like my parents, for example, who have lived in Nashville for 3 decades, or my mom has lived there her entire life. They are excited for the rise of the industry and the rise of, large firms that, it's like almost like a deviation from arts. But
it's
they
like, what,
like firms like Amazon
Yes.
or tech.
now
or-
just your word deviation from art?
Yeah, like I say they don't a lot, they're not arts industries, but there's a lot of excitement around the economic growth. But those two, like arts and other industries are those growing at the same time.
Okay. Let me add one more finding which may connect with each of these. Two. I got an email from people in the city government of Austin when they started that and said, we want to, and is that we heard you're working on stuff like this. How can we promote this and make sense of it and not just say this is bad or whatever? So we had some good discussion. But the more general point is what are the factors that lead to some of the social organizations like environmental groups or social service groups or human rights groups are 3 which we have available in the BizZip data. And this is called business zip code data, but the occupations include human rights workers, social service, organizations, human rights organizations, social service organizations. And those 3, plus there are others, political and government and so forth. Those 3 were used by a PhD student working with us. And he then analyzed what are the sources of these. That is, which zip codes have more of the kinds of organizations which do these kinds of things to try to get at tastes and the dynamics, not just using a big occupation. Okay, result, education was clearly important. I mean, some of the standard things, but equal to, and in some cases more important than education was walking. The proportion of people who, because the only measure we have nationally in the census is proportion of people who walk to work, but people may walk a lot, shopping, looking in windows, whatever, jogging, whatever, but we only have the data for walking and work, an imperfect measure. It's equal to education in explaining these kinds of organizations. Okay, so thinking about that, we then did a couple of papers on this. So we did the first one in the US and it was called Walk and Be Moved. If you think about it, if you walk to get on a subway or get in a bus, and then you take the bus, and then you come, but that is you're walking, let's say, a half a mile to get to the bus stop, rather than driving from your garage. You see more of the neighborhood. You see more of the people suffering, being angry, or you see good things as well as bad things that need improvement. And maybe you join or create a neighborhood association, an environmental association, to clean up that dirty 4 or 5 houses that are really covered with junk and nobody's living in them. You got beer cans and so forth. Grown in that nobody's mowed the lawn or anything for 3 years. That's it. Okay, so then to test that and might that be in turn related to something about the arts? So we put, so in the next paper, we did this internationally. We didn't do just the US, we did Canada and France. We did Korea. So we had Canada, France, Korea, and the US, 4 countries. And we had the proportion of artists and people walking and the numbers of these kinds of, especially environmental organizations and social service organizations. And we found in all 4 of the countries, having both the arts and walking had a bigger impact than if you just had one or the other. But they were both important, but together they had what's called an interaction effect. That is, they have the combination, the synergy of the 2 together. So if you are, as I was, I mentioned that I'm more sensitive to seeing things because I studied the arts. If you have that combined with walking and you walk by junk, you may say, hey, I want to really help people talk about a cleanup, a block club that will do this, or people in this. And so Wicker Park in turn has talks at one of the bookstores where they talk about exactly this kind of thing. Improve your neighborhood, help it, etc. Question, comment?
Yeah, my house bill is different, slightly different than you have. Just wondering how the idea almost of like if you think of media as this kind of culture of artisticness and creativity, and just from my own experience again in the UAE, I have especially like Dubai and Abu Dhabi both.
Especially what?
Like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, both biggest cities in the UAE. They both have this, at least from looking in, it's like almost this important media where a lot of the organic media that's starting to develop in the country is as a direct result of them bringing in previously artistic and people almost that not necessarily as a mentor figure directly, but bringing them in to perhaps deliver an event or to deliver a concert. Then that mobilizing and inspiring the local populace perhaps before they didn't have that exposure or perhaps wasn't as interested. But because they're being inspired by world-class artists, world-class musicians, it's driving innovation in the country itself. And that's what's pushing for us to perhaps a purely organic way, which you might see some of the other older denominations.
Yes, no, for sure, an international comparison, and that's a powerful example to focus on. And I think I mentioned session or 2 back that there's some countries that have even prohibited any international nonprofits from working in their countries because they don't want those hospital workers or volunteers or Doctors Without Borders to bring some of these. Maybe they won't dress like a proper doctor. So doctors dress very differently than they did 20 years ago, or probably in some countries that work today. The other examples that illustrate some of these things more broadly. We're working with people in Chengdu, China, city roughly 4 times bigger than New York, London, or Paris. Not as well known as Beijing or Shanghai, but it's growing faster in tourism and visitors and so forth. It's known for its panda bears, for its spicy Sichuan food,
but it's also, it's particularly, it's physically attractive. It's got some sort of natural lake and surrounding stuff within, it's warmer for the south. Their mayor learned about some of our scene stuff and said, hey, this is really important for us transforming the city in ways that we've been doing and thinking about. So he created a section that just dealt with scenes and linking them with specific activities. And then we've now been doing conferences together, and some of our scenes folks, there are a 400-page draft book. A big thing which has often been done is rivers. So I mentioned and showed you the video of the mayor of Seoul, where they tore down the freeway and they replaced it with walking. Okay, so walking, remember walking, walk and be moved, can lead you to feel and see these kinds of aspects of a neighborhood, which you may not see if you drive by 60 miles an hour or faster on the freeway. They have things, for instance, like a swimming scene to try to show how the river in Chengdu can be enhanced, and you can pay more attention to it. So they have swimming events. They'll have them, and they create swimming scenes, and then publicize them and have related things, which will, like beaches, like a cafe, like a place where you can change, you take a shower. So you can add related holistic scene amenities, not just the being in the water and swimming, but having other things which make the swimming scene become powerful enough to bring people there to want to swim there instead of in the swimming pool or somewhere else. Okay, so the point is, city governments are now doing this, and they may have done it in a sort of casual way, but they're interested in there actively, and we're working together both to get examples that work well in one city, and then to try to link these to broader concepts like the 15 scenes dimensions. How do you define swimming? Is it transgressive or not? So are lesbians transgressive now? Lesbians are transgressive in California. They're not in New York. Et cetera. So these are things which can be combined in different ways. And so if you combine, okay, so you've heard me briefly state it, but we're going to elaborate this further. And we're almost at the end of the, check this again. 2 minutes. One more question or comment? You two in the back have been quiet. Want to tell, just maybe briefly, just mention where you went to high school or where you grew up, and get a flavor of in your major, get a flavor of the diversity plus in class. Both what? Yeah, just a little bit louder.
We're both from Brazil.
Brazil, okay,
And we went to the same high school.
fantastic.
Yeah, and it's our first class.
What are you in a big city or small town in Brazil?
Rio.
Rio, okay, Rio, all right. I mean, a powerful, fantastic, famous, infamous city. Okay. There was a woman in a class with me who did a PhD in the art history department on guys from the favelas coming into other parts of Rio and performing music free and bringing the culture of the favela in the music, and then selling this not through the commercial capitalist companies, but selling it online in their own name and doing it successfully. And thus favelas, arts, music joined multiple neighborhoods in ways that I had never heard before.
Have you heard anything like that, or do you have any, this was maybe 10 years ago. Have you seen any more of that?
Yeah, it's very fun because those are.
It's very common, is what you said.
Yeah. it's very
Okay, now, great. Okay, very interesting. So, any elaboration on that point, or that is you have these fantastic, beautiful beaches, beautiful city, you know, the mountain, all of that. At the same time, that mountain is covered with favelas and it's politically salient enough that no local leaders tried to, you know, move the poor people away from that area. But any thought, and that is there, and there are lots of political demonstrations going on in Brazil now. So any thoughts on any of that?
No, I believe Rio is very interesting, considering especially the social and like political difference that you get all of favela right next to many of our, for example, which is more like the more gentrified region part of town, right next to the favela, you get huge disparity. And you said the music is something which is very interesting because funky, which is pretty much a Brazilian music style. Nowadays it's very popular. And there are a lot of like DJs, we call them MCs, and they become people of health producing music, sometimes multi-hits, and they can be very famous. And through Spotify, like due to the internet, they can become like very famous without the needs of necessarily investment. So yeah, real very interesting.
All right, well, I'm delighted to hear you're using these examples, and we will try to learn from each other more as we proceed, but we'll quit for now. We'll have a session on Monday, or no, today is,
Today is Monday, Wednesday. Today is Monday.
okay, then, so Wednesday is our review session for the exam. I think that's right. So it says on the, so, okay. So we'll have a review session for the exam, and then next week is the midterm. And I would say if you're joining the class late, I would still recommend taking the midterm, because if you take the midterm and the final, you can only improve your grade. So I'd say, you know, crash, work hard, you know, to read as much as you can, but if you just be thoughtful and write a good essay, I bet you'll do better than if you do nothing. Because if you don't have any midterm grade and you just want to get a basic, and just put all your eggs in one basket in the final, maybe you'll catch COVID or a bad cold 2 days before the final, and you may say, oh, I've got to do the final, and you won't be happy.
It's here, right?
No, the exams are online.
They're online?
Yeah, the review session is here, or the exams are only online for everybody. Okay. So we'll review the exam stuff next class.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you,
Thank
Professor,
you.
for shooting today.